off with a little activity. I have 2 polls for you. So if I could have the first poll brought up. Feel free to fill in as many choices as you identify with. Hope you are all able to access the poll. Feel free to fill out both questions. All right, do we have some answers? I'm looking to my tech folks to see how we're doing on the answers. Is it working?
It looks like we have about 20% of the people voting right now. So get those votes in, folks. We've got a couple more seconds here.
Let's hear from you. Let's hear who's out there. Oh, we have a problem.
Yeah, but I think we could work through it. The thing is, I think it's mandatory that you select question 1, but I don't know anyone here who, you know, I think this is the big social experiment. So if you're in the chat, you could say, hey, this question doesn't apply to me. And that's the point, I think.
That's great. All right, let's, everybody put in for number 1, the one you use least. Okay, here we go.
Oh, there we go.
All right. Didn't realize that. Learning something new every day. Ah, wonderful. So the first question, let me just point out that we all cross a street. We are all pedestrians. No matter what our major transportation choice is, we are always going to be on foot at some point. And it's great to see in number 2. I love that we have answers in every category because everyone is welcome, no matter how much you think about safe and healthy streets. And so let's look at number 2. The answer is you all on the majority, 55%, think about safe and healthy and equitable streets and access every day. That's fantastic. And I think that once your eyes are open, you almost can't stop thinking about it. So I want to leave you with a question I'd like you all to think about just for a moment and put your answers in the chat. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story first. So at UWM, just simply put, I found out through connections I had with the city that one of our major thoroughfares was going to be reconstructed. And no one at UWM knew about it. We serve over 20,000 students from all around the state, all around the city, about 3,000 to 4,000 staff and faculty, and we weren't even informed about a street renovation. So I'll leave you with this thought. If UWM isn't informed about their opinion of the streets running through their major university, who is engaged? And what community members are engaged? And that's where I was about 7 years ago, and that's what I was pondering. And so I want you to share in the chat, what was your aha moment that you and your community need to be engaged in your street design and access? And I really like emphasizing the word your street design. Let me see your answers in the chat. And as you are filling that out, I get to pass the mic over to Professor Schneider, who will take it from here.
All right, thank you so much, Kate. My name is Bob Schneider, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Urban Planning at UWM, and honored to be a part of the Safe and Healthy Streets group, along with Kate and Caressa and several other key community members, great people working hard for our city. I'm a white male with a collared shirt, a brown jacket, and brown hair that keeps on getting more and more gray. I have the honor of introducing today's keynote speaker. Before I do just a bit of housekeeping for the next hour, during the keynote presentation, we welcome everyone to type questions and comments into the chat, and we will try to get to as many of them as possible during the Q&A, which will be the last 15 or 20 minutes of the hour. Now to introduce our renowned keynote speaker. Dr. Anastasia Loukaidou-Sederis is a distinguished professor of urban planning and the associate dean of the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs. She holds degrees in architecture and urban planning and has published 10 books and more than 100 articles on issues of urban design, transportation, and community development. She has expertise on issues relating to mobility and safety, women's travel, transit-oriented development, high-speed rail development, intercity revitalization, gentrification, and displacement. She has served as a consultant to the Transportation Research Board, Southern California Association of Governments, Project for Public Spaces, Los Angeles Neighborhood Initiative, Los Angeles Metro, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the Greek government, and many municipal governments on issues of transportation and urban design. Her work is known internationally, and she is highly respected in our field of urban planning. It's an honor to have her here with us today. Welcome, Dr. Loukaidou-Sederis.
Well, thank you, Bob, very much. And thank you and all the organizers for inviting me to this very interesting and important summit, Safe and Healthy Streets. I wish I were with you in person, and I hope that in the future we will be able to do that. For those who are visually impaired, just a few words about how I look. I am a female. My pronouns are she and her. I'm white. I was actually born and raised in Athens, Greece, like Giannis Antetokounmpo. I actually very much, I'm rooting for the Bucks now that the Lakers are out of the picture, and I hope you go all the way. The color of my hair is brown, and I'm wearing a multi-color top. And let me share my screen so that I can start my presentation. I hope you can see everything. Let me lay from start. Okay, here we go. And so my topic, the title of my talk is Streets for All, Design and Policy Interventions for Age-Friendly Streets. And I want to say that when we fly, when we are up on the air and are approaching a metropolitan area in the United States, quite often we are flying over a large expanse of a grid of buildings and streets and a kind of extended blocks. And many cities from the air look like this, look like Los Angeles, although granted, Los Angeles is a huge and sprawling urban agglomeration. The most prominent feature that we see from the air are indeed these arterials, and sometimes the freeways, the spaces for the cars. And here is a picture I found from of Milwaukee from the air. And granted, it's not as sprawling as Los Angeles, but again, the main image are, of the streets, of the freeways. Indeed, in most American cities, the streets represent the largest acreage of space owned by the public. In Los Angeles, 35% of land is occupied by streets. And by the way, an additional 14% are parking lots. And streets may be public and can be used by all, but they privilege one use, of course, the movement and storage of automobiles, most of them private automobiles. When we zoom down at the ground level, here is how many of our arterials look. This is an arterial in Los Angeles. It could have been in other cities as well. They're very wide. They have narrow sidewalks. And by the way, I forgot to mention, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. And I hope I will be able to address them all at the end of my talk. But going back to my talk, so very wide, very narrow sidewalks, And at times, even the sidewalks are broken. They are sometimes even occupied by cars. This is on the right, what I sometimes encounter around the sidewalks at UCLA, where I walk. As a result, sidewalks are often empty. When I first came to Los Angeles as a graduate student many, many years ago, the cultural shock I received was not about the city. I have known Los Angeles and Hollywood from the televisions and the serials. I kind of knew how it looked. But my cultural shock was that the city sidewalks were mostly empty. As I mentioned, I was born and raised in Athens, which is a very dense and intense urban environment. Most of the hours of the day and late evening, streets in Athens enjoy a constant flicker of activities. I was familiar with other European cities, this is from Madrid, and Asian cities that typically accommodate an intense pedestrian activity on their sidewalks. So where were the people in Los Angeles? Sidewalks in most parts of Los Angeles County, with a few notable exceptions, were mostly empty. I have to say that urban areas where people enjoy walking have more than just a functional pedestrian infrastructure. Sidewalk users are more exposed to their environments than drivers are. They are not encased inside their vehicles. They move through the environment more slowly than people in the cars, and they can appreciate more of what's going around them. For this reason, sidewalk users also should require more from their environments. So a successful sidewalk is more than just a route from point A to point B. It is also a place to abide, to meet others, and to participate in neighborhood life. As a very well-known urbanist and journalist, Jane Jacobs, said about urban sidewalks, these are the city's most vital organs, where people experience or should experience city life, enjoy the rhythm of their neighborhoods, and watch what is going on. So pedestrianism, moving on foot or on wheelchair or with mobility devices, is only one dimension of the sidewalk experience. For this reason, sidewalks mostly thrive when they function not only as a pure pedestrian thoroughfare, but when they represent multi-use environments where people can stand, can sit, can move, can shop, can strike a conversation. So the absence of such multi-use sidewalks has prompted urbanism to call Los Angeles and many other cities in the US as designed for automobiles and not for people. And sometimes with really horrible circumstances, as Carissa was mentioning about the increasing crashes between pedestrians and automobiles in Milwaukee. Many US sidewalks, unfortunately, lack the people and variety of activities that characterize sidewalks in Europe, Asia, and Latin America. And I have to say, this was not always the case. 19th and early 20th century sidewalks in the US were vibrant spaces. You could find, for example, sidewalk orators. You could find political speeches going on. You could find street vending and promenading and socializing taking place. This is a street in New York, circa 1900s. You see a lot of people on the streets and the sidewalks. However, as policymakers began to perceive sidewalks exclusively as transportation thoroughfares and infrastructure, succumbing to what geographer Nicholas bluntly calls a traffic logic, they used the goal of unrestricted movement as justification to restrict other sidewalk activities. Removing These activities sap the sidewalk of life and vitality. The singular view of streets and sidewalks as transportation corridors, later combined with policies that overwhelmingly favored motorists over pedestrians, inadvertently made walking a less critical dimension of urban living. So in this talk, I will tell you two stories that relate to streets for people. First, I will explain why the vibrant and full of social activity sidewalks of the late 19th and early 20th century US cities progressively emptied and became single-purpose spaces in the late 20th century. And second, I will discuss contemporary efforts and strategies of planners and communities to reintroduce pedestrianism and walkability and social activities in the sidewalks of US cities. Lastly, I will try to articulate a vision of how our streets should look if we want them to be designed for people of all ages. So by the end of the 19th century, sidewalks had become important elements of the urban infrastructure, and many US cities started paving thousands of miles of sidewalks. Streets and sidewalks served for many different economic and social activities. In commercial areas, sidewalks extended the realm of the adjacent stores. Shopkeepers would display their merchandise on sidewalks. They would store deliveries and overstock on them as well. There were a lot of so-called street peddlers. These are street vendors that were making a living outdoor on the sidewalks. Newsboys would convey information to the passers-by about the news of the day. Sidewalks were also around for social encounters, to meet friends, acquaintances, and even strangers. So the sidewalks were both a route to move through, but also a place, a destination, a way to move through the city, but also a place for commerce and social interaction, and even political protest. This is a picture from the Wobblies, a well-known labor union of the early 20th century, and they had staged a protest around the 1910s in Santa Monica. You see a streetcar on the background. But as motor vehicles started multiplying, traffic engineers began to focus narrowly on efficient movement and transportation. Cities started prohibiting the abutting property owners from using the sidewalks as extensions of their businesses. In this process, walking for transportation became sidewalks' primary purpose, and the pedestrians' unobstructed mobility on the sidewalks justified municipal restrictions on other sidewalk users. Consequently, the pedestrian became the sole public, the only public for whom the sidewalks were provided. So local city planners and traffic engineers started widening their streets at the expense of their sidewalks, changing the streets from a locally oriented public space to a transportation corridor, to a transportation artery. As you can see here, this is Dearborn Street in 1910 in Chicago. You see trolleys and you see vehicles. The sidewalks are still full of people, but they are on the sidewalk. In fact, planners would start considering pedestrians eventually as obstructions to the automobile. The sidewalk shifted from being the most convenient space for walking to the only legitimate space for walking. As pedestrians became to be seen as encroachers into the street, they were viewed as a source of accidents and congestion. City councils started restricting pedestrian crossings to intersections, required pedestrians to obey traffic signals, and instituted fines for jaywalking. So as automobiles proliferated in the 20th century, newspaper editorials in the 1930s start blaming pedestrians for accidents because they defied the rules of the road and walked into moving vehicles. Pedestrians are really pretty dumb, a columnist from Westways, a magazine, well-known magazine, wrote in 1937. As early as 1912, urban infrastructure trade magazines, such as the American City, advised widening streets at the expense of sidewalks. And multiple cities did so. Pedestrians were banned from streets to make room for cars, as many activities were banned from sidewalks to make room for pedestrians. But the sidewalks had never been about walking alone. And so in the process of creating an efficient transportation system, public officials and municipal engineers also made sidewalk life disappear. When cities redefined sidewalks as transportation corridors, they also gave themselves another reason to control sidewalk life. They started issuing sidewalk ordinances that multiplied as the 20th century progressed to control or ban many sidewalk activities such as street vending, the display of merchandise, public speaking, expression of political dissent. So by the middle of the 20th century, urban sidewalks were used for fewer activities and more people started spending time in controlled environments like shopping malls. I did a study in the early 2000s surveying the 10 largest California cities, and I found that public officials continued to deploy 4 strategies in their downtown areas that all devalued the sidewalks as multi-use public spaces. The first strategy I called a de-emphasis of sidewalks through design. Cities often sought to de-emphasize sidewalks by developing sunken and raised plazas and elevated walkways that disassociate the spaces, the public spaces, these plazas, from the public street and sidewalk. In downtown commercial areas, cities let developers of private plazas and open spaces to use enclosing walls and blank facades. So you see, for example, on the left-hand side, this is a plaza, Noguchi Plaza in Los Angeles. It's a nice plaza inside, but if you're on the sidewalk, we're completely separated by these double walls. You can see nothing inside. Or on the right, you see a sunken plaza that is actually 3 levels down the street, again, drastically separated from the public sidewalk outside. It siphons in pedestrians from the sidewalk. People can shop there, have no idea what's going on the sidewalk. And then you also see the skywalks that you see on the upper headquarters. Cities like Minneapolis, St. Paul, Detroit, Boston, Cincinnati started creating a different pedestrian level with sidewalks connecting their buildings at a different level, allowing pedestrians to go from parking lots into the buildings, into other offices without having to set foot on public sidewalks. And one can say, and I don't know if Milwaukee, if you have these skywalks, one can even justify some of these cities using these sidewalks because they have a harsh winter. But sidewalks started appearing in cities with much warmer climates, such as Dallas in Texas, Los Angeles in California, Miami in Florida, San Francisco, Santa Cruz in California. Actually, on the upper right-hand corner, you see a skywalk in Los Angeles. A second strategy that cities have used to really antagonize sidewalks is gentrification. Some cities sought to gentrify select sidewalk segments to make them attractive destinations with shopping and restaurants and bars, while making few, if any, improvements to the remaining sidewalk networks. These efforts included upgrading the streetscape over a few stretches of sidewalks through a mix of public art, street furniture, decorative lighting. As you can see on the lower end of my slide is the 3rd Street Promenade in Santa Monica, California. And on the upper right side, you see Pike Street in Long Beach, all of them destination areas. Cities have enacted these pedestrian districts with ordinances. They encourage only specific land uses such as cafes, bakeries, restaurants, flower shops, boutiques, galleries, bookstores. Architectural and landscape design guidelines are issued to promote certain design themes. The objectives are to increase land values and economic viability of these areas, but in the process, small independent businesses, mom and pop stores, small food stores that used to be there can no longer pay the rents and are being replaced by chain stores and upscale retailers. So this new consumer orientation, reflected by the higher prices, the more upscale merchandise, creates a subtle but quite effective screening mechanism and makes the sidewalks comfortable for only higher income consumers and higher income retailers, those that can afford the rent. A third strategy is privatization that antagonizes sidewalks. Many states have enabled business improvement districts, the so-called BIDs, in which business owners tax themselves to augment public services or provide improvements for a designated district. Services offered by BIDs, typically include sidewalk beautification in these, again, specific stretches of sidewalks, sidewalk cleaning and maintenance. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that, but also private security officers. These BID security officers ensure that sidewalk activity is not disruptive to businesses, and some residents, urban residents, are considered as nuisances if they don't fit the BID's desired image for the neighborhood. So here you see this layer of private security officers, the so-called purple patrol that rides and walks along the seats of Broadway and tries to push away people that look homeless, people on skateboards, bag ladies, etc. Another form of privatization is fencing. I get a kick out of this because here you see a kind of a way, a savvy way for a private owner to extend his property into the public sidewalk to fit his or her car. But in the process, about a foot of public sidewalk is taken away. Sometimes fencing might be required by ordinances, as is the case of California, where state law stipulates that alcohol can be served only in enclosed and demarcated area. But so while in cities like Stockholm or Paris, cafes blend seamlessly into the city sidewalks, as you can see on the left, too often in the US, hard boundaries and fences privatize public space and separate it very drastically. So you see the right-hand side is from Los Angeles, and I don't know if you can see it, but there is a fence that separates the cafe on the left from the sidewalk on the right. And finally, the last sidewalk control strategies that I found in these 10 California cities is containment. To contain what they perceive as undesirable uses, cities directly or indirectly sanction activities in one area to keep them away from others. For example, what are considered undesirable uses? They can, street vending, street performing can be considered undesirable uses. And so you see on the left is from a street vending district that back in the early 2000s was designated in parts of MacArthur Park, a large park in the central city in Los Angeles, where the vendors had to rent this cart and really vend from that cart. This proved to be extremely unpopular by street vendors. They had to pay money. They had to be on these vending carts that looked one the same like the other, kind of like Disneyland. Eventually, the city didn't have many takers. On the right upper hand corner, you see a street performer. Cities like Santa Monica require that street performers move every 3 or 4 minutes. Street vendors in the city of Santa Ana, another city on my survey, they have to be constantly on the move. So while all this is happening in commercial areas, many residential streets, especially in inner city areas, in Black and brown neighborhoods where low-income minority residents and older residents live, have experienced significant disinvestment. Sometimes, I forgot to mention that there are a lot of street ordinances, but a lot of these ordinances are also selectively implemented. So we see exactly the same activity happening in both slides, but it is much more likely that the Latino vendor on the right who sells orange juice is going to persecute it and fined, and possibly the oranges and the juice confiscated, and the kids on the left that sell lemonade, this is not going to happen. So I was just mentioning that a lot of the residential streets, we see disinvestment. And this disinvestment is much more visible in neighborhoods where we have minority and older populations. So just before the pandemic, I conducted a study in one neighborhood called Westlake in Los Angeles. This is just 2 miles west of downtown Los Angeles. Is a primarily Latino and Asian American neighborhood, but also a lot of older adults live in this neighborhood. So I took a dozen of older adults along with my students, each one separately, on a walk around a block. These older adults live in a multi-family senior housing, affordable senior housing. And we would take them one by one, and we would ask them to take a walk around the block with us. And we would say, we're about to take a short walk. Please don't look for anything in particular, but tell me about the things you see, you hear, you smell, everything and anything you notice. I should say that this is a technique that decades ago was used by a well-known urban designer and scholar, Kevin Lynch, not with older adults in particular, but with citizens in Boston and New Jersey and Los Angeles. He was interested in finding what were imageable elements of the built environment. Our purpose was to focus on older adults and find how easy or difficult was for them to walk in their neighborhoods. So this study showed the tremendous amount of disinvestment on the neighborhood streets, the lack of upkeep and maintenance. There was trash, and these are some of the comments of people that they were telling us as we were walking. There is so much trash all over the street and sidewalk. The sidewalk is sticky. It has even dog crap that people don't clean. Sometimes it's hard to make a step because of the trash. The street is full of waste, food waste. I have even witnessed a driver dumping his trash on the street at the stop sign. There were no trees. There are no more trees, said an older gentleman. There used to be trees. A business owner can say that the tree is impacting his business and call the city to remove it. There are now holes on the sidewalk where trees used to be, and they get filled up with trash. And there is another concern for older adults about this unevenness and the holes, because one of the most major concerns is about tripping and falling. And unfortunately, many of these sidewalks are cracked. The sidewalks are deteriorated, said a Latina woman. They're very uneven. The cracks make it difficult for me to walk. I have to be always looking down and find a path that is even, so my cart doesn't get stuck. One of them actually mentioned that when she wants to walk, she walks on the corridor of her building because she's afraid she's going to trip and fall in the sidewalks. You can also see graffiti and barbed wire fences. There is nothing nice to look, said a Korean gentleman, all along our streets, only graffiti and barbed wire fences. And there are no benches. I want to take a rest break on this little wall. She was showing us a wall. You see, there is nowhere for me to sit and take a rest. I often have to walk a shorter route because of lack of places to rest. Having some benches would have been useful. By the way, these blocks are quite long. And traffic impediments were very much on the minds of these older adults. 7 of them mentioned about how wide the streets are, talked about the intersections, the short traffic signal, the fast-moving traffic, the reckless drivers, the impatient drivers. I need to hustle across the street because there isn't enough time to cross before the light turns red. I don't feel safe crossing at either crosswalk. I walk slowly and the light changes so quickly when I'm in the middle of the street. At the end of the walk, we all ask them what was the most stressful part of their walk. And the vast majority of them said crossing at an intersection and seeing the light turning red, and then having to hear people honking and shouting at them. And this is a word cloud we created out of the frequency of words that people use. You see, trash was the most prominent, shade, the lack of shade that was, uneven sidewalks, cracked sidewalks, the lack of trees. So the disinvestment that I'm describing and the municipal interventions that I described before, all these ordinances that outlawed a number of social activities or allowed them after permits, have really served to empty a lot of public sidewalks. That was the answer to my question when I came to the US many, many years ago, while US sidewalks are empty. So I want to turn to the second part of my talk, because not everything, I don't want to leave you with a very doom and gloom image, because I know there are a number of planners and city officials and communities that are working to reverse this trend. And I know that you had Seleta Williams yesterday, and I hope she really told you what she and her office are doing. But let me tell you nationally that, 4 strategies that cities have started. These are complete and living streets, pavement to plaza strategies, parklets, and much more recently, during the pandemic, slow and open streets. So complete streets, the concept of complete streets, which is a concept that is all over the world, which means that the streets are not only for people, but they're not only for vehicles and vehicular traffic, but other modes of transportation as well, appeared in the US in the early 2000s to challenge street designs that prioritize the automobile. Instead, complete streets are designed and operated to enable pedestrians, bicyclists, motorists, and transit riders, all to use the streets, to have equal rights from these streets. And the Complete Streets Act was issued by the US Department of Transportation in 2009. And it defines effective and complete street policies. it directs the states to adopt such policies within 2 years of the enactment of the act. It directs the US Department of Transportation to develop a strategy to ensure compliance with the act. The states that do not comply would have a percentage of their surface transportation funds directed towards traffic safety projects. And it authorizes research and data collection, technical assistance, and dissemination of best practices. And so as a result of that, we have over 1,200 municipalities around the country enacting these policies. The concept of living streets takes the concept of complete streets further. A living street is a street that is designed primarily with the interests of pedestrians and cyclists in mind, and as a social space where people can meet and where children may also be able to play safely. It privileges non-motorized transport, what we call active transportation. It gives emphasis to design for health. It provides an enabling environment, even for vulnerable groups, and it embraces streets as public spaces. And the principles is a design that accommodates all users, that uses the appropriate speed for the surrounding context, that designs for safety and designs for safe intersections. And so to accommodate all users, we really need, and when we mean all users, we mean all users in terms of race and ethnicity, in terms of age, in terms of ability. So you have to accommodate people in wheelchairs, you have to privilege accommodating older adults and younger kids. You really need to use appropriate design standards, the sidewalk width. You have to consider the traffic signals to privilege these most vulnerable groups. Sometimes use of medians to increase comfort crossing, provide adequate lighting, reduce the street crossing distances, reduce speed, automobile street speed that is, reduce conflict points at intersections, really design safety features for the convenience of all users, and use possibly innovative signal timing techniques. And considering the needs of vulnerable populations is a key. You heard Carissa saying that a lot of the crashes happen in the Black and brown neighborhoods. And this is a general trend. These are the most unsafe in terms of traffic safety neighborhoods because of disinvestment. Vulnerable populations are the older adults. I mean, when we all are going to become older adults, we should not be having a stress, panic when we are crossing our streets. The transportation design and engineering know of a number of traffic calming techniques, from the reduction of lanes to the reduction of lane widths to privilege, let's say, cyclists, to really creating medians depending on how much space you have. These can be long and continuous medians, or could be shorter medians, what they're called also refuge places for pedestrians. Roundabouts, they're more known and common in Europe than they are in the US, that sometimes they seem a bit confusing to motorists. Ways of increasing the sidewalk at specific crossing points, they're called chicanes. Raised pedestrian crossings, these are all very well-known means through design to make streets safer. Speed cushions, speed humps, and the way we allocate streetscape is important. By reducing the lane widths for the car, enhancing our bike facilities, enhancing our sidewalks, and even rolling lanes for active transportation modes. There has been a lot of fuss just before the pandemic about the scooters. I don't know if you have them a lot in Milwaukee. And I think the fuss was because there was not an allocated lane and the scooters kept bumping onto pedestrians. You could walk and people were throwing their scooters all over their sidewalks. I even like what Copenhagen has, how humane to have what they call a conversation lane. You see here a woman with her daughter biking next to one another and chatting. And the ever forgotten street furniture, pedestrian lighting, extremely important for safety and for comfort and convenience, trash receptacles, landscaping and shade, enhanced bus waiting areas, benches, extremely important, especially for older people. And what are the plug-in components, the components that can connect to the larger transportation system, such as bike share and bike stations, scooter share, where the scooters are parked in particular places and not, thrown in the middle of the sidewalks, van pool and feeder buses, park and rides. A second major category of strategies is the so-called pavement to plazas. It started in New York with Janet Sharik Khan, their street commissioner, where she used underused streets, and American cities have so much underutilized streets. She helped transform them into vibrant social public spaces. The program was a key part of the city's effort to ensure that all New Yorkers live within a 10-minute walk of quality open space. And the importance of this is that it is quite cheap to convert these underutilized spaces. The design means are simple and cheap: colored pavement, movable, colorful chairs, umbrellas, planters, bike lanes. Collaboration with community groups is extremely important because it is the community groups that have to identify which are the places they really want in their neighborhood to be converted into this pavement to plaza. They are the ones that have the local knowledge and know where these places are needed or not needed. On the lower-hand side, you see a similar place that used to be an underutilized space for cars that became a plaza for people. The third strategy are the parklets. And parklets emerged from the low-cost conversion of small and underutilized residual spaces originally devoted to cars. Most of the times, these are parking spaces, into spaces for the passive and active recreation of people. And there are all kinds of typologies of parking spaces. They can happen in residential areas and in commercial areas. They can occupy just one parking spot only one day, and this is the very well-known parking day. These are not as effective. They're more symbolic to show that we reclaim spaces from the cars. They can take up diagonal spaces. They can be seasonal, as in the city of Philadelphia or in cities with cold climates. They can be year-round, as they are in San Francisco and Oakland and Los Angeles. They can even occupy an underutilized traffic triangle. This is how a diagonal parking space, a couple of diagonal parking spaces for that matter, were converted into parklets. This is a parklet in downtown Los Angeles that I worked with my team to help the city make happen. And we actually did 1 year later a survey, and this is a word cloud. There were many more people than prior to the parklet attracted to the street, and you see there are all good things: good, relaxed, happy, comfortable. And the last strategy, the pandemic brought upon us, but it's one of these things that I hope they do remain if communities want them. And the slow or open streets are residential streets close to through motorized traffic, or allowing motorized traffic come in, but in much slower speeds, to promote safe physical activity and allow physical distancing. And so you see some images from around the country. In New Orleans, there were about almost 800 people surveyed after the city created Moss Street into a slow street, and 77% said that they were using the street, not driving through it. 34% were biking, 32% were walking, 19% jogged. In Sarasota, Florida, you see a street that was converted to sitting. You didn't have to eat there, you could just sit and relax. And the purpose behind this strategy is to make streets into places, to facilitate social uses, to reflect a community's identity. But to do this, you really need to include communities as co-designers. You really need to privilege a lot. If there was a criticism, if there is a criticism about these slow streets, is that they appeared mostly, again, in the city's well-to-do areas. But where they're mostly needed are in the areas that have been disinvested in terms of their streets and sidewalks. These streets can invite more physical activity, can support social connectivity, can be pleasant and accessible, can prioritize the slowest users over the fastest users, can balance mobility with other public space functions, can serve as play space. These are actually images from Mexico City, where I worked with a community there and with the mayor's office, and they created in a neighborhood play streets. But this is a more recent example from Philadelphia. The Play Streets program in Philadelphia was particularly effective during COVID, during the pandemic, because it allowed children to play in their neighborhoods, reducing the chance of disease transmission from other communities. Streets for dining. This happened all over the US. I have some slides from Walla Walla in Washington and from Sarasota in Florida. And street for vending. I mean, it happens all over the world. In the US, it happens in flea markets only, but why not certain streets really opening them up for street vending? Portland has actually created these pods at underutilized, not used parking lots in the city and created these taco trucks and at the same time made a whole area much more vibrant. This is a new shelter at Brooklyn Laboratory Charter that was created by design firms, but it acts as a provisional outdoor classroom. So streets for learning. So I would finish with a quote from 1913. And this quote said, "Streets and sidewalks have been likened to the arteries through which flows the lifeblood of the city, trade and traffic. But they're more than that. They're the meeting places of the people, the playgrounds of the children, the allurement to recreation and vice. Here, persons of all ages and tastes go to meet one another, to talk over the affairs of the day, to be entertained, to eat, to drink, to inspect shop windows, to do marketing, to buy and sell merchandise, and to perform 1,000 offices, which the exigencies of city life make profitable, healthful, or agreeable. Streets and sidewalks connect every household." I hope we can recapture this 1913 vision. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anastasia. That was fantastic, and it's generated some discussion in the Q&A as well as in the chat. So if you would like to read the Q&A directly from that section there, you're certainly welcome to. I could also read those for you if you'd like, however works best.
Sure, I see 2 questions on the Q&A, and then I see a lot in the chat. I'm not sure. So let's start with the Q&A.
Yeah.
So there is a question from Carissa. What is your insight on whether there are any communities in the US that are focusing on designing streets with gender and or the care caretaking community in mind. So I would say that this is a very important question. And actually, I didn't have the time, but I very recently completed a global study of 18 cities about sexual harassment and street harassment. And you find that this is, unfortunately, a very omnipresent phenomenon, although there are major variances from cities to cities, with much more sexual harassment happening in a lot of streets in Latin America, but also Los Angeles, and especially in transit environments. I focused on college students and transit environments, waiting at the bus, being on transit vehicles. And these create a lot of safety concerns. They discourage young women, and I would also say, because women, transgender people, and LGBTQI people from using public spaces and transit environments. And I have a ton of recommendations that we will run out of time. It's a whole different topic, but I would say that there are a number of things like, good lighting, public education campaigns about when you see something, say something, because a lot of these women were saying that they were bystanders, noticing the catcalling and the harassment and doing nothing. There are apps that people can use in real time that other cities have done that directly connect to getting help. So there are a lot of strategies through design, through public policy, through education that can serve to minimize street harassment and sexual harassment, which is really a very important concern. Okay, there is another question from Bob, from you, right? Do you want to?
Yeah, I'll just ask it in a maybe simpler way than I wrote it out there. But Courtney from the chat also had some additional comments on there. And one way to ask this is, should we be designing every street for all types of people? And another somewhat related question is, should we be designing every street for all types of modes of transportation? Those are two different things to think about that I think can help frame our discussion a little bit.
Yes. No, I mean, we cannot design everything for everything. As we know, transportation planners know there are different categories of streets, and some of them, for example, accommodate transit. Some of them do not accommodate transit. Some are classified as different types of arterials, etc. And some are residential streets, some are commercial streets. It is very important to take into account the community context where these streets are, and the community context in terms of the particular characteristics of people. Is this an area that has a lot of older people? Is this an area that has a lot of children? Is this an area where you have a lot of, crashes? Is this an area that has a lot of schools? So the particular context, the physical context, is very important, but I come back and back again to the concept of community and safety auditing with communities, because I think that what transportation departments are not doing that much is to listening to these community voices who are the experts, taking community groups for a walk around the block, as I did. It's very simple, listening to their concerns and what they want to see, and kind of inviting these diverse voices, and then creating a system that may not have, I mean, I'm very much opposed to universal type of design. What I mean, not the universal design, which is for disabled people, but universal by the means that we design everything the same. We really have to articulate what the needs are and design a street system that gives opportunities and chances for all. And so if we need a play street, we don't need to have all our streets as play streets, but each neighborhood could have a play street, right? So I hope I responded to the question.
That's really great. Thank you. Very insightful. I don't see, I think I do see another question that has come in. So let's see that from Virginia Small. How do you suggest promoting the return of benches to Milwaukee's downtown streets? Except for bus shelters, most were removed about 30 years ago, and it's a big hurdle to get them back, except in the more privileged historic Third Ward section of downtown.
I would very much advocate for benches. Again, especially for older people, they're absolutely required. I don't know why the city removed them. I suspect they may have widened the streets, or they really wanted more sidewalk space. But where you put benches, as I showed, some design means you can widen the sidewalk in certain areas through something that is called the chicanes, and you can put a bench. So there are ways of widening the sidewalks, even if not throughout the whole sidewalk, if you don't have enough space. But benches are absolutely necessary, certainly where there are bus stops, but I would advocate for benches, especially in downtown areas where you have long blocks. They're absolutely necessary. And I don't know how you're doing with street trees, but we really need shade as well.
Absolutely. I have another question to insert here, unless others have more to add in the chat, but we didn't hear too much from you about on-street parking for automobiles and how that has affected the street environment and the public interactions through space along sidewalks. So I wondered if you have a comment about street parking and how that's being addressed in the past as well as today.
Yeah, I think that I'm for street parking as long as we don't, you have to invite my colleague Don Shoup, who is the guru of parking, of course. I agree with him that we have too much parking. But I like street parking instead of huge structures where it is needed, because it does provide a protection between the pedestrians and the more fast-moving traffic. So, for example, where you have parklets, if there is a street parking lane, it protects from the fast-moving traffic. But I think that cities should really take an inventory into how much street parking they have. Do they need all that? If not, convert it into parklets or do something better with their street parking. But overall, I think that street parking, and some studies have shown that street parking usually helps slow down traffic because people stop, park, etc. And so the cities that I'm very familiar and talked about in the beginning of my talk, which was from Latin America, from Asia, from Europe, they have street parking. So for it, of course, again, talking about the different contextual environments, there may be places, specific streets in the city that you may want to eliminate street parking if you want to create more pedestrian activity, or you want to create more slow streets and you don't want the cars, even if they're stored, taking space. But overall, I don't see much wrong with street parking as long as it's not excessive.
Yeah, next question, we got one from David. He says, just to not be entirely critical of my comments, he has a question: how might we better engage with and train civil and traffic engineers to get them to truly consider all users when designing street infrastructure?
That's a good point, and I don't want to be too critical too. I think that, civil and traffic engineers are municipal employees, usually of transportation departments. And I think that citizens should advocate their needs to the city and city hall and the city council members and their complaints, and they are being passed over. Coming to the educational side, I'm actually quite heartened that we see a number of institutions starting joint programs, sometimes between planning and civil engineering, where people are getting a more well-rounded look. So it is not only the efficiency transportation engineering standards that define what a good street is. And, the city planners by now have much more, through education, and I think, Bob, you would agree, because you are in academia as well, we do our best to train our students to the merits of pedestrianism, of cycling, we have now courses about bike planning and pedestrianism and all that. And the fact that we're starting joint ventures, I think that would help in the long run. But I think as a community member, I think you should really present, you should be active. You should present your complaints to your city council, to your neighborhood council, and this eventually will come to the ears of the departments of transportation and transportation engineers.
I see a question here and from Megan O'Connor, and it's from the chat. Would you prioritize street parking as the lowest element that slows traffic? I'm afraid that keeping parking will be the main reason for safety instead of looking at better design features. I think she may be referring to other curb extension uses of the street, potentially cycle tracks. So that's something to be considered, I think.
Yes, absolutely. And again, I want to mention I'm not an expert on parking, and I would definitely recommend that before the city dedicates street parking, because my experience is that in many areas, a lot of these spaces go underused and underutilized. And so instead of thinking that we're going to store cars, it's much better to use other. I agree with you, but it is, again, one of the things that is very contextual, even though I know it raises some of the most heated debates in Los Angeles are about parking, with a lot of the business community fighting for their parking spaces and a lot of citizens fighting against the parking spaces.
Well, we have one last minute to finish up here because it's getting to break time, but I wanted you to finish on what gives you the most hope for our streets. A final thought on that very quickly. Given what you've seen these days, what gives you the most hope?
Well, I think I ended up, the first half of my talk was a little bit dark, and the second half was more, was lighter, in the sense that I have seen over the last 10 years, much more emphasis on making the streets better for active transportation. And I have seen, I'm sure Seleta talked about the Vision Zero. I have seen finally municipal departments thinking about how do we make our streets safer, healthier. I have seen, even in the pandemic, I have seen many more people walking and biking. There is a huge issue of equity that I believe cities should tackle hands-on, because where the biggest needs are in the areas of the city that are where the most vulnerable populations reside. And as I mentioned, the slow streets were mostly not in these areas. And I think that that's where we need community activism to make city halls aware of that. But overall, I think I'm optimistic because I've seen a number of these strategies. And I guess, as you, Bob, you are also very much interacting with younger people. And I have seen a lot of motivation and idealism among my students that want to change our cities for the better. And I think it will happen.
Well, we'll end there. Thank you so much, Dr. Anastasia Loukaidou-Sederis. It's an honor to have you. A fantastic presentation. We'll be taking just a 1 or 2 minute break before our next session gets started, but thank you again.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me. Bye.